This story begins with an ending. A girl was lying on her bed in her dark room while a violent storm raged outside her window. She felt worse and worse with each passing second and was losing her strength, but at the same time she didn't understand why this was all happening to her. That day, as it rained heavily outside, the girl realized that the end of her 4-year struggle with the disease had apparently come, and now the end was near. So the girl realized she was dying. But in fact, everything had gone wrong 5 years earlier, when her husband's business stopped generating income, missing absolutely everything, and it was difficult for her to even get a little money for a basic meal. On days like this, she would eat her last crumbs of bread she had left over from the previous day and hope not to starve to death. Well, suddenly she felt some weakness in her hand. Her fork fell. When the girl tried to bend down to pick it up, she herself fell to the floor. At that moment, she felt an intense pain in her chest, but in fact, she had no idea that she would be on the verge of death for lack of money for her own treatment. Now she was most upset because she had been very foolish at the time. Of course, she had no money for treatment, and she didn't even have enough to eat. And now, as the end is nearing her, the girl is 30 years old. She has lived her second decade in marriage, and now she is unjustly dying. As the girl lay there and her strength was leaving her body, the maid grabbed her arm and told her that she couldn't leave like that. Madame exhaled heavily, then asked, "Hasn't the Count arrived yet?" The maid was silent for a while, but afterward the girl said that the messenger had already gone to him, and so he should arrive very soon. The girl, of course, doubted whether he could really come to the dying woman, that husband who was not there for his wife who was at death's door. But the reason for all this was a very obvious thing, namely that she had no children, and even a rancid mouth remains a lineage. So the husband surely needs at least some heir. However, he was never born. 3 years had passed, and her husband was tired of trying already, so much so that he even started treating her as if she were some kind of villain. He talked about how it was all her fault, but the girl didn't understand why. If the problem was her, he, walking left and right, had never had a successor from any woman. So the girl at that point had already begun to doubt whether the problem was really all about her. Still, as much as she wanted to believe it, one reason they'd been together for over a decade and hadn't divorced was that he needed to keep his marriage to her to get her family's money. Marquise Nelson regularly sent money to her husband, who had squandered his fortune. So of course, it made no sense for him to divorce her. At the time they were first married, her husband, Earl Page, was an up-and-coming businessman. The work, mostly concerned with jewelry, was quite profitable as long as the quality and design were good. However, when at one point his business suddenly faltered, the husband invested all his money and land in a neighboring country to mine precious diamonds. However, in the end, when the search began on that land, it turned out that there were not only no diamonds, but nothing at all, but useless stones that are worthless. That's why they now live in a shabby house without proper servants or lighting, and it's constantly cold because there's not enough money to even just make a fireplace. And so, while the girl lay on the verge of life and death, she thought over everything she had been able to do for these years, and she became every minute sadder and sadder, because she realized that it was all useless. And suddenly the maid said that Princess Grinda had arrived. The girl was a little surprised, but said she could come in. Then a girl came into the room, her longtime loyal friend named Daisy. She had blonde and very pretty hair. Of course, they had the kind of relationship where there isn't even such a formality as asking permission to enter. So she ran straight into the room, without waiting for an answer. As soon as the girl saw her best friend, she immediately cheered up. She couldn't believe that Daisy had actually come to see her. However, at that moment she suddenly started coughing very hard and almost choked to death because it was hard for her to breathe. Daisy was very worried and told Sienna not to overstretch herself so much and just lay back and rest. Of course, it was all rather ironic. However, it was to this girl that her husband's entire enterprise was passed on. Earl Moore. He was Daisy's brother. He also, himself like Sienna's husband, was in the jewelry business and absorbed his husband's enterprise, expanding his influence. The situation was strange and confusing enough, but it was bound to happen sooner or later anyway. Sienna lay back on the bed, and in a heavy, tired voice thanked Daisy for coming after all. The girl suddenly wondered what she was talking about. After all, they were very close, and she couldn't leave her alone in the same terrible situation. Sienna smiled and said that it was very good that she had it, for she would be very lonely alone right now. Daisy, however, took her hands and told her not to say these silly things, but to pull herself together. Sienna suddenly became nervous and said that the disease could be transmitted even through touch, so she'd better get her hands off. Well, her friend kept squeezing her hand tightly and told her not to worry, but to forgive her for coming so late. She said in a confident voice that she should have visited her much earlier. Daisy looked really sad and said that if she had known how the girl was suffering, there was no way she would have come so late. Sienna was about to interrupt her and say something, but the girl wouldn't let her. She asked why she hadn't talked about the fact that she didn't have money for us to call a doctor. Daisy, because of her strong feelings, even cried. She asked if she wasn't worried that the girl wouldn't help her with money if she asked for it. Sienna didn't know what else to say to her, so she simply apologized. In fact, she was worried about the girl herself, at that moment afraid to see her crying face. So that sent everyone from the houses, even Nancy. Daisy hugged her best friend and said that it was incredibly hard, but she was sorry for the way things had turned out. But at that moment her voice suddenly became harsher, and she told Sienna not to be so sad, for it would be a comfort to her. And then she asked why she was going to die so soon. The girl looked at her in surprise, and after that she saw a sly smile. She also said in a rough voice that she wanted to watch her some more. Sienna was very surprised to hear this and asked what she meant. She looked very worried, for she didn't know her friend was capable of such a thing. Daisy went on, however, and said that she had been doing a pretty good job as her maid of honor all along, after all. The girl so said that she is a higher status than her, as if she were her maid of honor, but then suddenly changed her mind and said that now she is much higher than Sienna. She is the wife of an earl. But here is Daisy, the wife of a marquis. So she has achieved quite a great success, even more than Sienna. And this pleased the girl very much. The poor lady could make no reply to this. She just lay there and watched it all in shock. And Daisy, for her part, added that it was true what they say. A man must always be ambitious. She also said that she couldn't live like Sienna because it must be so hard to be so helpless. The girl turned to Daisy and said that she had absolutely no idea what she was saying. But at that moment her friend smiled and easily said that she seemed very surprised and apologized for such surprises. The girl simply said that it was incredibly easy for her to talk, thinking about the fact that she didn't have long absolutely to go, and yet she'd held quite steadfast the whole time. Daisy also said that she certainly wouldn't have survived if she were her. The girl had no money or fame, having finished playing again would surely have gone to the women at such a crucial time. She inquired with a smile on her face. How could it be that even this man had left her, seeing the worried face of her friend? She said that she was referring to her husband, for he was very windy. Of course, everything would go bad if such a person took on any business. She was a completely naive wife, and he an unscrupulous husband, so they ended up being a very perfect couple. Sienna wanted to say something, for she was not comfortable listening to all this. But Daisy went on, saying that she probably didn't know what she was talking about. Then the girl smiled and said she was referring to the mine in question 5 years ago. It was a tip-off. Here was their family. Here was Moore County. Daisy said that she had told her that because of the huge amount of debt, her husband had decided to go into the diamond business. So her brother had started that rumor about diamonds and lent the financing. She smiled and also said that she already knew the outcome. It was an easy victory for them, and her husband had been screwed. Sienna grew more and more worried and asked what she was saying. How could she say such horrible things to her? Then Daisy said that relationships with people are actually very easily broken. Her cough, when she clarified that it could be borne very easily, everyone immediately changed their attitude towards her. But she said, smiling, that in fact after all it was not transmissible at all, for then all the maids would have died long ago. Sienna was coughing hard again at this point. She had blood on her face and also got some on her best friend. Daisy, when she saw this, straightway grimaced. She became very angry with the girl and started to leave, for she was disgusted with the whole thing. Sienna, closing her eyes, was very upset. In fact, she thought this girl was her real friend. She was very hurt that it had happened like this, because she didn't deserve it. At that moment, she began to realize that her body was growing weaker by the second, and it was as if she could no longer feel it. Sienna realized that now it was definitely the end. And then she closed her eyes and fell into a deep sleep. But just a second later, her eyes opened. She was in some very bright place, and she thought that it must be heaven, for the day was in full swing. If she were in hell, it would probably be very dark. But then suddenly Sienna heard someone coming, because the footsteps were quite fast and loud. Then she heard someone's voice addressing her as mistress, but she had no way of knowing who in heaven could be coming in her direction at all. But then suddenly that voice became much louder, and it called Sienna by name and very insistently. When the girl heard it, she was immediately alert. She rose a little from the grass and saw that voice belonged to Daisy. As soon as she heard that voice, she immediately froze. The girl couldn't believe that it could really be Daisy. Sienna didn't understand how she could even get to heaven, and if she wasn't even dying, so it couldn't even be possible. But Daisy was getting closer and closer to her and was about to touch her shoulder. However, she immediately moved away from Daisy, screaming loudly. The woman was a little startled as well and screamed back. But then she suddenly turned sideways somewhere and started yelling, saying they were here. At that moment, a young boy and another girl immediately came running to them. As soon as they saw the lady, they were very excited, but at the same time happy to have found her. Sienna just sat there staring at them, not understanding what was even going on, or why they were on this side of life. She probably knew she was dead, and she was the only one who died, but somehow all those people went to heaven too. Daisy, suddenly seeing her worried face, asked if she was all right, and said that she had called the people familiar to her to make sure everything was all right. However, Sienna, upon hearing her friendly communication, was very surprised, not understanding how such a thing was even possible, since it was definitely not how she had interacted with her quite recently. Before the girl's death, Daisy humiliated her to her core, and now she dares to ask if she's okay. Sienna was just furious. She suddenly stood up from the grass and started screaming, asking what the hell she was doing in this place. Daisy didn't understand why she was answering her so rudely in the first place, so she asked what it was about and what had happened to her in the first place. But the girl only repeated her question, asking what she was doing in heaven. Daisy, hearing this question, was confused. She did not understand what was the matter with her friend. She turned to Lord Bolt, asking what was going on, and asked him to explain everything to her. The man was a little surprised himself, but she waved her hand and asked that they take Sienna to the chambers and get a doctor. The girl, hearing of this, became even more angry. She, after that incident, began to notice what Daisy's manners were after all. She points her out to people as if they were her personal servants, and it was so familiar. The girl did it so casually, as if it cost her nothing, and it made Sienna's mood grow worse and worse. She didn't understand why she should see all this horror even after death. Seeing the girl's face, Daisy suddenly smiled and said that she'd actually better get checked out. Then she held out her hand and offered to lean on Lord Bolt if she suddenly felt worse. Sienna couldn't stand it anymore and suddenly started screaming very loudly, signaling for the girl to stay away from her, because it was unpleasant for her to be even just near her, and herself thought about the fact that she couldn't understand anything. What was going on at all and why everyone was acting so strange? And then the girl suggested about the fact that she was already going a little crazy, even in paradise. After calming her feelings a bit, she decided to reach for the Lord but changed her mind and said that she was actually fine and she could not lean on her own, and those on their own could as well. Sienna then picked up her hat, which was lying nearby, and Daisy decided to show her friendly concern and asked if she was sure she could go. The girl, hearing these words, only looked at her angrily. She didn't understand how her best friend could act like this at all. However, Daisy was very concerned and said that she had, after all, fallen from quite a height, and the girl wasn't sure if she was all right. Sienna was very surprised when she heard about it, and then wondered where she had fallen from. Her friend pointed somewhere off to the side, showing where she had fallen. Daisy said that she had climbed up there to get her dress, but in the end, she couldn't hold on and fell right out of the tree. Then she looked at her friend worriedly, and asked if she didn't remember the whole thing. Sienna, when she heard this story, was incredibly surprised. She didn't understand how she could have climbed a tall tree at all just to get some of Daisy's handkerchief. The girl thought about the fact that this was perfectly ordinary, and she would have done so in ordinary life. But these events seemed very familiar to her, and then she realized that this was the behavior of her 18-year-old self. Then the girl turned back to her friend, and after scrutinizing Daisy from head to toe, realized that if you looked closely, she too looked much younger than she had before her death. Then Sienna started looking around, trying to figure out where she was and what she should even do next. She saw a familiar enough area. She shifted her gaze to the people standing next to her, and looking closely at the Lord, she realized that he too had somehow grown younger. Then a thought came to her mind, but she immediately dismissed it, realizing that it simply could not be. Daisy, after speaking to Lord Bolt and smiling, turned to ask if she had accidentally hit her head during her fall. Sienna was just furious. She realized that this couldn't be happening, and she couldn't be in this place anymore, so she ran away. Her friends immediately ran after the girl to make sure she was all right, and the maid said she would bring cold water for her. After a while, they did persuade her to go back to bed. When the girl, having changed her clothes, lay in bed, she looked at the leaf and was distressed. It was some kind of letter, and Sienna just couldn't believe that it was the 420th year at this point. Daisy was a little surprised at her friend's behavior, but she said that it couldn't be otherwise, and asked if she was sure she didn't need to call a doctor. Perhaps she had something serious, since she couldn't even remember such elementary things. However, the girl refused and said that apparently a doctor would not help at all. Sienna suddenly pinched her finger and realized that if she was experiencing feelings, it meant she was awake. Suddenly, Daisy spoke again. She said that even if she thought she was all right, you never knew if the problem had been there all along, because falling from such a height was no joke. The girl herself thought about the fact that maybe it was all about her looking too normal, but she was still intimidated by the thought that it had been a whole 12 years since that moment. The girl concluded that she had gone back 12 years and ended up falling out of a tree, but there was absolutely nothing normal about it. So Daisy certainly can't calm her down until the girl herself gets used to the idea. Sienna stared at her friend for a while. Then she felt a little uneasy and smiled. Yes, if asked if there was something dirty on her face, she didn't understand why the girl was looking at her so intently. But she quickly turned away at that point and said that there was nothing there, and she was just looking, and also asked if she had been very worried when Sienna had first fallen. The friend immediately made a guilty look and replied that of course she was worried, because it was impossible not to worry when she had hurt herself so badly. Sienna was very indignant when she heard this. She thought it was all even funny, and maybe right now she was contemplating making her a bridesmaid. Those cheery words of hers about how incredibly nice it was for her, the fact that she was fine, were just lies. And looking once more at Daisy's joyful face, the girl couldn't stand it any longer. She grabbed her by the hair and started pulling hard. Sienna started calling her names and asking her to shut up and stop lying to her face. Oh, when the girl heard this, she was shocked and asked her friend in a trembling voice what she was saying. Sienna repeated what she'd already said and kept pulling her hair. She then shoved her very hard to avenge her wounded feelings, and told her that since she had decided to mess with her, she would keep the turnover shut until the very end, rather than chattering her tongue in front of a dead woman without 5 minutes. Daisy was sick of being the only one being hurt, so she grabbed her friend by the hair and started yanking hard as well. Sienna, for her part, continued to shout out some outrage about making her some kind of bridesmaid and all that. For a while longer they pulled each other's hair. Daisy asked what she was even doing, but the girl kept calling her names with all the hatred in her eyes and voice. Daisy asked her to wake up already. After all, it was her best friend. But Sienna said she knew all that without her. The girl finally let go of her hair, and her friend stepped back some distance. The girl let go of her hair, and her friend stepped back a little, shouting, asking her what she had done to her, and what Sienna had gotten into her head about her. None of it was really real. Sienna sat silent the whole time, just staring at Daisy and picturing it in great detail in her head. Her friend touched her shoulder, asking what she was thinking about so much, because the girl didn't even avert her gaze anywhere. But Sienna wasn't going to stand for it. She slapped her arm, and she didn't say anything. Daisy realized that her friend didn't want her to touch her, so she immediately removed her hand. Sienna then tried to keep her voice as innocent as possible and apologized, saying that she didn't know what was going on, but that various thoughts were going through her head. In fact, the girl didn't notice how she had fallen into her own thoughts. But then she thought that if she really had gotten to the past somehow, it was obvious that she could not go back. After a while of silence, her friend worriedly said that something was really wrong with her. After all, she looked completely unwell. But Sienna recognized that there was absolutely nothing wrong with her head. It was a little frustrating, because she wanted to claw at her hair and beat her up for all the things she'd done to her. But to this she only smiled and said that everything was fine, and she was perfectly fine, so Daisy could go back and do her business. This reaction from her girlfriend didn't like it, and she frowned. She stared at her for a while, but then realized that Sienna was being serious, and that she really needed to leave. Soon Daisy rose from her seat and walked toward the exit. She watched her friend intently for a while longer, but then she stopped. As she walked out the door, Sienna finally exhaled with relief. But then various thoughts came over her that it was incredibly strange for her to be at her 18th birthday, because that was exactly the time from which everything had gone wrong. What hurt the girl most was that she would have to live through these horrible and painful times once more, and she didn't understand what she had done to make it so wrong. After a while, Daisy suddenly visited her friend again, and turning to her, said she wanted to talk about the Marquis Nelson. Sienna herself realized in that moment that she didn't have to live her life the same way she did the first time at all. She could change her actions in theory. Daisy, in turn, asked if her friend could go with her to his place, since she didn't really want to go alone. Sienna thought about the fact that if she was somehow in her past, she could theoretically change it and all this unhappiness would go away. Daisy, smiling, said that they had decided to have fun together after all. So she was even counting the days until they traveled together, and this would be their perfect opportunity to spend time together. Sienna remembered the last time she had agreed to this proposal very easily. After all, she trusted her friend, and was very happy that they would be able to spend time together. But now the girl realized that she would no longer be such a naive idiot and would never let anyone fool her again. Of course, Sienna had also agreed to this trip, but she now had a very good knowledge of the future and was confident in her actions. It had been quite a while since the girlfriends had finally packed up and hit the road for a new journey. Daisy, who had been gazing admiringly out of the window the whole trip, turned to her friend and asked that she look at the sky, for it was incredibly beautiful. Sienna, who was sitting across from her, pondered for a while on how to talk to her friend, and after a while Daisy suddenly turned to her, asking if by any chance there was a magic key in the Marquis's lock. Sienna was a little confused as to what it was for, better yet, but then she remembered that if you looked into it at midnight, you could see your future partner. So Daisy was looking forward to the occasion, for she was very curious to see who she could see there. In fact, from one very common rumor, many visitors to the castle were acting just like Daisy, and I was eager to find out who their soulmate was. But Sienna looked out the window and, showing no interest, said she had no idea who it might be. In fact, in her previous life, when they had come to this lake, they had never been able to see anyone, and she felt a little sorry for that, but she hoped that at least this time, maybe something would come of it. At this moment, Daisy suddenly turned to her and cheerfully asked who she wanted to see there herself. The girl, after this question and herself, wondered who she wanted to see there, so she remained silent for a while. Then she shifted her gaze to the rad, cheerful friend who sat across from her, and thought that if Daisy had to learn anything after all, it was that she needed to actively show attention to her prospects. In fact, her partner used to be destined by her own family, and she thought fate had no meaning. That's how she had to marry Earl Page, and Daisy wanted to contact Prince Grint after she was already with the Earl. But the girl suddenly wondered what might happen this time if she interfered with this grand event. But at that moment, Daisy suddenly turned to her and said that something had cheered her up so much. She wondered if she'd remembered something good. Sienna smiled and said it was, and thought she was just thinking of a plan to stop her vanity. The girlfriends chatted for a while about how eager they were already for the next day to arrive, because they were excited about it, and eager to find out what was in store for them. Near midnight, they finally arrived at the castle and were assigned separate rooms so the girls could get a good night's rest. Sienna had already done all her nightly treatments, and as she was about to go to bed, she was suddenly visited by someone in her room. Of course it was Daisy, and she didn't even knock. The girl was dressed in a very pretty nightie, and she was holding a special lantern. Sienna was very surprised. She didn't understand how it was possible to just walk in like that, since the girl hadn't even said it was possible to do it. Well then, she inquired as to what had happened, and why she had suddenly come to her in the middle of the night. Daisy then inquired if she wanted to go out with her in the night. She also said that a lot of people talk about how the spring should only be looked at during the full moon. Sienna thought for a while about the fact that she had been foolish at that moment, wanting to tell as well as show her absolutely everything. But the girl didn't understand why she needed to if she ended up betraying her by stabbing her in the back. So yawning, she told her friend that she was feeling a little under the weather and wanted to go to bed early to get her strength up. But Daisy looked at her friend suspiciously and wondered if she was so suddenly ill, for as soon as she came in with her, everything had been perfectly all right. Sienna smiled then and said that she herself was surprised at how sudden it had happened. She had suddenly gotten a fever. She apologized, but said she just needed to rest, and she thought about the fact that she didn't care whether her fake friend believed it or not. She wasn't going to sit with her the whole time anyway. Daisy thought about it for a moment, but then she said that she could rest for the day. She stared at her friend for a while longer, and then she walked out the door with her head held proudly high. When Sienna was alone, she sighed heavily and thought about the fact that she knew exactly what would happen in her life in the future. She meets him again, one of the two princes of Beyland, namely the very same Prince Harrison. Though at the moment when they first met, the girl had no idea who he really was. As she was walking through the city, she suddenly saw a man in distress and instinctively went to rescue him. Of course, she couldn't think of anything else when he fainted. The girl had been taught that it was obligatory to help people if they were in trouble, so she called Mr. Bolt to the stranger and asked him to help her. The two of them took the man, who was still unconscious, under his arms and began to lead him away. Lord carried him calmly for a while, but then suddenly he saw that the stranger had a trickle down his face, and he was about to let him go, but the girl did not let him. Soon afterward they finally brought him straight home and put him to bed. The girl believed him when he told her that he came from an ordinary family. But soon after his recovery, a letter came to them bearing a very famous seal, and when Daisy saw it, she said it was the seal of the Prince's Harrison family. Sienna couldn't believe at that moment that this Logan ended up being Prince Fabian Logan Harris. But as soon as they opened the letter, Sienna immediately snatched it up and said it was an invitation. She also asked if she could go alone. She was glowing with joy and told her friend that she really just had something to tell him. Of course, Sienna from the past agreed to this step, because she knew how much her friend cared. She dreamed of his bride spot, but surprisingly, Earl Grint was also there. It was after this meeting that she eventually became Grint's consort. Sienna, thinking about all of this, lay back on the bed and didn't understand why she hated her so much. Even though she had everything she'd ever dreamed of, she had it all so easy. She didn't understand why she needed to destroy her husband's firm and ruin Sienna's image in the community. It was still a mystery to her. The next morning the girl was sitting at the huge table eating breakfast. Soon Daisy came in and wished them good morning. The girl immediately moved farther away from her, and thought it was subconscious and completely unnatural, but ended up saying hello to her too. After all, that would be impolite. The maid soon set the table and left to do the rest of her chores, and Sienna wondered how she had gotten on last night. Daisy sat down across from her friend and said that she had gone there with Julie, and they had looked at the lake together. Then the girl immediately inquired whether she had seen the one who was her destiny and who had appeared there. And she thought about the fact that the girl, as always, answered briefly, and in order to find out any information, you have to pry all the time. But in fact, it even surprised her that Daisy had gone along with the maid there, and decided that she was really quite interested in her, since she had gone to such lengths. But she sighed heavily at that moment and said that unfortunately there was no one there. In fact, it made her very sad because she was expecting to see someone there. Sienna tried to look surprised and said that she would be lucky next time. At this moment, one of the maids brought for the girl her breakfast and wished her a pleasant appetite. But Daisy turned to her, asking if she had seen her partner in the spring. The willing woman said that of course she saw him there, and the girl in turn inquired, and what he was like. Sienna was very surprised when she heard this. She didn't realize that this was even a girl saying this, and most importantly for what purpose. But the worker smiled and said that she saw Sienna's grandfather in that lake. He was very handsome and just as she remembered him. When Daisy heard this, she asked in surprise if she had really seen a clear face there, but she then wondered why no one had appeared to her yesterday in that case. Then she asked the old woman if she knew the exact way to see her partner. The old woman stroked her head, smiled, and asked if she really wanted to know the secret. The old woman smiled and asked if she really wanted to know the secret, but she said it was a company secret. She then turned to Sienna and said that this girl was seeing their valued guest, so she thought she could tell her. Daisy didn't even let her say a word. She told her grandmother that she could certainly tell her grandmother everything, because she was so good to Sienna, and she would keep the secret to herself. Since no one objected, the older woman said that many people say that on a full moon, you can see your soulmate if you look into a special lake. Daisy was immediately indignant, and said that apparently that was why she hadn't seen him, because there was no full moon that night. The old woman smiled and said that it was a very important secret, so it should never be told to anyone. The girl immediately thanked her and said that she would keep their secret. Sienna watched silently the whole time, smiling so that she wouldn't be asked any questions. And at that moment she thought about the fact that no matter how much Daisy tried, and no matter how much she wanted to, she still wouldn't see anyone there, even if there was a full moon. Then she continued eating her breakfast, and suddenly realized that surely it must be soon. And looking at her watch, she tried to remember what time she had gone out then, and seeing the time, assumed it was about the same time. In fact, Sienna was a little worried even, for it was coming just as the day she should meet Prince Harrison, and so, as she continued to eat her breakfast, she tried to remember what he looked like, since she hadn't seen him in quite some time. After that, the girl gradually started to remember his appearance. The man has very deep red eyes, dark hair, and a gentle atmosphere emanates from him. At first, Sienna even thought it was hard enough to find any approach to him, because he didn't express any emotions. But if you get to know him better and have patience, he will reveal a completely different side. This man is very handsome and has manners, even in front of people who might annoy him. He was so polite and friendly that Daisy took him well, even when he introduced himself as a commoner, though she couldn't stand such people. But she didn't understand why he had hidden his identity and come to the Marquise's castle. It was still a mystery to her, and one she would have liked to solve. Her grandmother had already left, wishing them a good appetite, and Daisy suddenly noticed that Sienna hadn't eaten a crumb from her plate. She looked at her in surprise and asked if she was hungry. Sienna looked in surprise at her plate, which was completely filled with various foods, and marveled. But then she said she didn't feel like eating that day for some reason, and pretended to take another bite out of her huge steak, even though she didn't. Sienna could not eat, for she had been absorbed in her thoughts all this time. She did not know how to find out the truth, for Daisy was the reason she had not answered the invitation the other day. So she decided that she would ask him this time, for he must call her just as he had done that day. Soon the girl stood up from the table and waved her friend's head and said she would be on her way. Daisy quickly stuffed the last piece of pie into her mouth and stood up from the table and said that she had eaten too, and they could go together. Sienna was a little surprised at this behavior from her friend. She didn't understand why she was so eager to go with her, but she knew there was no way she could get away with it. The girl thought about the fact that if her memories were to be believed, one of them should be offering to take a walk right now. But she didn't know who exactly. And so, while she was pondering this all this time, Josie immediately ran up to her and taking her hand, asked her if she wanted to go for a little walk. Now she remembered at once that it was Daisy after all. But in fact, she was worried, because she knew what was going to happen, and it frightened her a little. However, Sienna smiled at her friend and said she wouldn't mind going along with her. Soon they went outside and walked a few yards, strolling through the garden, when suddenly Daisy stopped and said that she could no longer walk. Sienna looked at her in surprise, not understanding why the girl was being mean. After all, she was even with an umbrella against the sun and she shouldn't be hot. In fact, she was very annoyed by her friend's behavior because she didn't understand what Daisy was doing. They'd only been out a few minutes before. But after that she saw that Bolt was also standing next to the girl. And now it all made sense to her why she was being so awkward. It was all because of his presence. Daisy sat down on a bench that stood nearby and said that Sienna could go ahead and she herself would sit for a while. Then Lord Bolt stood between the two girls, not knowing what to do or which one to stay with. Daisy pointed to the seat next to her and suggested that he sit with her. There weren't many people on the road anyway, so the girl could be left alone. Sienna frowned and thought about the fact that the girl was now trying to even take a guard away from her that didn't even belong to her. But she smiled and decided to agree, telling Bolt that the place was deserted, so he had nothing to worry about. Nothing could happen to her. After that, the girl turned around and started to leave, thinking that Daisy could rest there for ages because anyway, she already knew who she would meet in that place. Soon she walked some more distance and came to a very familiar place, thinking that it had happened somewhere nearby. But then suddenly, as she rounded the corner, she saw the silhouette of a man lying on the floor and immediately realized it was him. Sienna was in an incredible, intense panic. She didn't know what to do, but she tried to calm herself down, because she knew this was not going to lead to anything good. She told herself that everything was fine and he was still alive, so she had nothing to worry about. For a while the girl just stood and watched the man lying in the middle of the grass and not moving. This sight only made her feel uncomfortable, so she decided to walk up to him and after apologizing, wanted to say something to him. But when the man said nothing, she remembered that he couldn't hear her, after all. But Sienna got a closer look at his face. She recognized it was definitely him. She saw the man dressed as an ordinary tourist, and despite the fact that he was covered in mud, anyone could recognize that he had a rather unusual appearance. Then she started shouting somewhere to the side, addressing Bolt, and asked for help, saying that there was an unconscious man here. The man, who was standing nearby, immediately asked what she meant, for he had not heard very well. But the girl ran up and asked him to go quickly, for it might end badly. Uvolte immediately ran up to the scene and, seeing the unconscious man, inquired what had happened. The girl immediately replied that when she arrived, he was already lying down. Then the man, having examined the stranger, said that he was very badly wounded. So it was better to bring him to the castle at once. But then, looking around, he saw no one, and asked the girl in surprise, "Did she really say that he was lying in that place all alone?" Sienna stepped aside and, seeing some prints in the grass, said that he must have been originally a horse. When the man shifted his gaze to the stranger and said that apparently it was indeed so, for his head looked badly wounded, and it was quite possible that he had fallen off his horse, Sienna worriedly asked if he could get him to the castle as soon as possible. The man lifted him onto his shoulders, then Daisy came running up to them, turning to the girl and asking what had happened here in the first place. The girl was not surprised, for she was still as quick as she had been in her previous life. Then Daisy shifted her gaze to the stranger Lord Bolt was dragging, and asked, "Who is this man anyway?" But she took a closer look at his face and suddenly saw droplets of blood running down his cheeks. Daisy was very frightened when she saw this, and began to scurry off to the side, screaming loudly as she did so. Sienna wasn't the least bit surprised by this, but she was annoyed that the girl was being so noisy. Yes, Daisy was moving farther and farther away from the man, bloody, and then suddenly she didn't notice the rock under her feet. This caused the girl to hook over, however Sienna was behind her and instinctively caught her. But when she realized what she had done, she immediately let her friend go full on, realizing that she had done it completely by accident because she hadn't meant to. After leaving Daisy alone to lie on the grass, and us followed her guard and that man. Daisy was a little hurt by this behavior from her friend. She stood up quickly, however, and walked over to her and asked what was even going on. In fact, in the past, Sienna had started to reassure her, telling her that everything would be fine and she had absolutely nothing to fear. However, she wasn't going to do such nonsense now. The girl walked on with her head proudly up, and Daisy ran up to her and asked, Is he really dead? For he's bleeding? Soon, Daisy thought a little more and moved closer to her friend, already wanting to ask a question, when suddenly Sienna turned to her. She put a finger to her mouth and asked if she could keep her voice down. After all, they actually have a sick person. Daisy was a little surprised at her friend's behavior, but said nothing, for she did not want to get into a conflict. They went on their way, and Sienna was very much pleased with herself for no longer wanting to accept her naivety. They soon brought him home, and when the man woke up, an elderly woman went straight to him. She knocked and said she would be right in, without even waiting for an answer. The guests had rewound his head so that no more blood would come from it, and he was awake by then. The man sat on the bed and tried to figure out where he was. When the older woman entered the room, she smiled and asked if he was okay now and feeling well. He was about to say something when he suddenly felt a sharp pain in his head. He was silent for a while, and afterward he asked, "Is this the castle of the Marquis of Nelson?" The old woman smiled and said that she was the mother of the Marquis, and she added that he had come to the right place. But apparently he didn't get there very far, for her boys found him and brought him straight to the manor. They also told her that the man had hurt his head, so he was unconscious. Sienna stood behind her grandmother and just watched him. In fact, she was feeling quite embarrassed about the whole thing. When the man listened to everything, he said that now he understood everything, and also gave his name, because he had forgotten to introduce himself before. He said his name was Logan. However, this name does not mean anything at all. In social circles, he is known as Fabian Harrison. The older woman gave him one last smile and told him she had more business to attend to, so she would go and they could chat for now. When she walked out the door, for a while everyone just stood in awkward silence, unsure of what to say to each other. Daisy spoke first. She turned to their unexpected guest and wondered what had brought him to their territory. Logan explained that he travels to different parts of the kingdom and was just on his way to this place from the Walton region. Sienna, upon hearing this, thought about the fact that he also had some plans of his own this time, which no one knows about but himself, of course. Daisy, on the other hand, when she heard about it, pretended to be very surprised and said that it must be very exciting. But the girl herself already knows everything, so it's even more difficult to understand what this commoner's plans are if he ends up becoming a marquis anyway. Even Daisy was very annoyed that she didn't manage to get the title back then. But then suddenly the girl laughed and apologized for the indelicacy. But then she asked if his mother was an aristocrat. Logan was very surprised when he heard that question, and asked what she meant by that. Then the girl explained that he didn't look like an ordinary commoner at all, so she inquired. However, Logan interrupted her and said that he was just that, a commoner. Sienna was a little surprised when she heard about it, because she didn't expect it to be exactly as it was then. She thought that the plot would probably change in some way. But it didn't. Daisy in turn smiled and said, "Now I understand everything." But in fact the girl knew perfectly well what would happen next, and it was the height of obscenity what she would say after that sentence. Then the girl smiled and said that he was still behaving very unusually in front of a member of the aristocracy, so she thought that he was also an aristocrat since he allowed himself to behave like that. Sienna felt very awkward about it because she knew all those lines ahead of time and realized even now that it had all been inappropriately said. There was actually a rather important reason why she had memorized those words that day. It was the first time she'd seen that side of Daisy, the dark side that she'd kept very carefully hidden under her mask. Logan, when he heard those words, was a little surprised and even started to get worried, but then told her that if she thought he was being rude, he apologized. In fact, when Sienna thinks about it now, she realizes that the girl had never seen a commoner be so unwavering in front of her before, so it probably threw her off. After a brief silence, however, Daisy smiled and said that she didn't mean it at all, and wasn't one to adhere to a strict hierarchy, so he could behave as he felt comfortable. It was at this moment that her mask of a good and obedient girl reappeared, but Sienna didn't really understand looking at her, who would act comfortable when looking at her facial expression. However, Daisy was still not satisfied. She said that it was the first time she had ever seen a commoner traveling alone, because they were usually busy with hard work and didn't have time for it. But now the girl knew that this time she was wrong after all. For if she knew who she was talking to now, she would regret what she had said. But then she thought it made no difference at all. Who was he? For she spoke too ill-mannered, though she was an aristocrat who ought to have some manners. Aunt Daisy said that the servants in her house couldn't even dream of traveling, let alone make it a reality. And then she told Logan that he must be doing pretty well if he could afford it. Sienna was furious. She knew that this man now sitting next to her was the Marquis, so they would obviously be doing better than Daisy. But the girl also didn't understand how she could, in her past life, just keep quiet and watch what was going on. Daisy continued the conversation and asked if he liked the Walton region, for she had heard that there, unlike here, much of it was grassland. Logan said it's a pretty peaceful place, and it's different than here. You could even see the sheep running freely in the pastures. Then the girl wondered if he'd thought about where to go after that. The man shifted his gaze to the side and said that for starters, he planned to at least leave this castle the next day. Daisy was starting to get angry at this point. She clenched her hand into a fist and told him to stay a little longer. The girl came closer to him and, taking his hands, suggested that he rest, for it was such a blessing that she had found him. For if it were not for him, there would have been some trouble surely. When Logan heard her words, he looked surprised and wondered if it was really her, Sienna. Watching all this, he looked at his friend Sienna in surprise and couldn't believe that she was really saying those words. However, Daisy confidently repeated and said that it was Sienna who had saved him. If she had come a little later, it might not have ended even that well. Sienna, both then and now, thought Daisy said some rather odd things, but she didn't have the courage to sell her voice and ask her anything. The girl, of course, knew this and continued to do her mischief. However, this time it's going to be completely different, and Sienna is not going to make her previous mistakes, so she won't even know. Nothing she won't watch Logan invite her or anything like that. She won't let that turn of events happen. So Sienna took her friend by the shoulders and turned her around to ask her what she was talking about. Because while she was saving this Logan, she almost fainted at the mere sight of a drop of blood. I looked at her in surprise and wondered if that was really the case. But you could actually see the surprise on the girl's face. Sienna was pleased with herself, for it was immediately obvious from her facial expression that she hadn't even thought that a girl could say such a thing. Then Daisy made the most innocent expression on her face and said that she didn't recall any such thing, and added that Sienna must have gotten something mixed up. She smiled back and thought about the fact that her ability to change her facial expression was an amazing skill, and maybe it would even come in handy for her more than once. And making a surprised face, Sienna asked Daisy if she really didn't remember, because she had seen Logan and called for help. And what did the girl do? She saw the blood and was very frightened, even screamed. Sienna thought she'd had enough of the various lies and needed to speak plainly. Taking credit for herself was very ugly, even for a girl like her. Daisy didn't say anything, smiling, just looked at her friend and tried to understand what was happening and why she suddenly changed so much. The girl went on and asked if she had lost her memory because she had found it and Bolt had brought it. Sienna smiled softly and said that she probably needed some time to think and remember all the events. But then suddenly her friend couldn't take it anymore and wanted to call her some bad word, but quickly closed her mouth so she wouldn't do anything more stupid. When Sienna saw it, she realized that it wasn't that serious this time, so she assumed that it was probably because Daisy had been caught lying. Sienna shifted her gaze to Logan, who was watching their argument with a completely stony expression, and she wondered even more what was going through his head right now. After a short silence, Daisy finally put her friendly mask back on and said that he needed to lie down a little longer anyway. It would do him good. But the man insisted and said that he was fine and could move about. Then the girl said that as far as she could remember, he had said he had come as a traveler and asked in surprise if he didn't like it here. Logan looked very grave and said he would stop in the permanent court in such a case, for he had nothing to do in that place in the Marquis's castle. Sienna suddenly noticed that Daisy, who usually walked around with a smile up to her ears, only made that face on one occasion. It looked serious and surprised at the same time. The girl turns to Logan and asks why he's so reluctant to give up his good motives. Besides, He doesn't even have any false excuses for leaving. So she asks that he accept, because she can lend him one. At the end, she also said that it was very unkind of him to refuse a nobleman when he offered his help. Sienna, hearing her words and seeing the look on her face, realized that what she had planned was not going at all according to her plan. But she was surprised to hear herself say the words, to obey when an aristocrat spoke. Daisy turned to the man and told him that if he didn't like the room, she could find him another one. Sienna was even more outraged when she heard all this. She did not understand how her friend could dispose of it like that. Even though it was the residence of the Marquis Nelson, they were hers. The girl did not understand how on earth she could give away horses and offer new rooms, though she herself had not even asked his permission to do so. She in turn bowed to Logan and said she would try to talk to her grandmother about it, but she was pretty sure no one would mind. Daisy suddenly laughed and said that the most important thing in this castle was grandmother, so she would have to get her permission. Logan didn't say anything to that. The man was silent for a while, and then he said he understood, and in that case, he apologized for bothering her. Sienna decided to take her friend away before she said more stupid things. She also told Logan that they wouldn't bother him anymore. The girls were soon out the door, and when Sienna saw Daisy's indignant face, she wondered why she was sulking all of a sudden. She then inquired of her friend if she would not go to her own place. Daisy, however, looked at her angrily at that moment. Sienna was a little surprised, but actually remembered that she had seen that expression on her face in her past life, right before she died. Then the girl suddenly grabbed her arm really hard. She said that she really wanted to talk to her. Her voice was very cold and rough, but Sienna decided not to show any emotion and, smiling, said she wouldn't mind. And at that moment pulled her hand out. In fact, the girl was very happy to see her friend behave this way, because it was exactly what she wanted. Daisy was silent for a while, staring at her friend. She looked at her friend, searching for the right words not to say too much. Sienna thought at that moment, did she seriously assume that she could be frightened by this atmosphere she was deliberately conjuring up? But it wasn't like that at all. She's lived 30 years of suffering and agony, and she's only 18 at the moment. So she's already seen a lot in her life, and she knows more than this girl who's standing across from her right now, trying to intimidate her. Then suddenly Daisy looked her straight in the eye and asked what was happening to her. She really didn't understand. Sienna was very surprised that before she could actually be frightened somehow by such trifles. But now she was completely calm and asked the girl what was wrong with her behavior, why she thought it was strange. But her friend suddenly got angry and started raising even her voice, saying that she had embarrassed her in front of that guy. She wondered if she didn't like what she had said about saving him so much. Sienna then, smiling, said that she was the one who didn't like it because it wasn't nice of her to do that. Daisy, when she heard this, was very surprised, and seeing her confused face, the girl thought to herself that apparently this was not the reaction she had expected to hear. Well, then Sienna began to assert her rights, and turning to her friend, said that she, after all, at that moment had done nothing at all, and had not helped in any way, but was only afraid. And the fact that she'd almost fainted from a single drop of blood back then was more of a nuisance than a help. When Daisy heard that, she was really surprised. She didn't know her friend could stand up for her rights like that, because she'd never done it before, and it was starting to make her angry. The girl wanted to say something to her, but then suddenly changed her mind and only looked at her angrily for a while. Sienna looked back at her with a smile and thought about the fact that if she didn't have anything else to say, she should leave rather than just stand there and be angry, unknowingly. After a while, Daisy turned to the girl and told her that she was still her only friend, and then wondered if she could really do this to her. Sienna mentally laughed at those words, but in reality, she never thought that her nature could come out to this extent. She doesn't even hide her arrogance by saying those words. First, the girl insults and humiliates her, and then tries to pretend as if nothing happened. And Sienna herself at that moment thought that it was really true, and she had absolutely no friends at all. In fact, in the past she had been unable to communicate with anyone but Daisy, who had enveloped her completely with her companionship. Well, at this point, Sienna started to remove the hand that the girl had placed on her face, and said that this was actually the Marquis's castle. She thought to herself at that moment that this wasn't the right place for her cheap threats. But Daisy pretended not to understand, and asked what difference it made where they were. Does she think she doesn't realize it's their castle? Sienna then replied in a gruff voice that you could tell from her demeanor that she really didn't understand anything, and then wondered if she was the first to suddenly offer Logan peace and a new horse. She smiled and told Daisy to bear with it, since she was the nobility herself, because there were going to be many more things that wouldn't go according to her plan next, and she should get used to it. 24 hours had passed since then, and all three of them sat down at the huge table to eat breakfast. Sienna sat and thought about what she'd been worrying about before. All the others sat in silence and did not speak, but only waited for the food that was soon to be brought to them. Daisy then smiled at their new guest and asked if he had heard of that magical spring nearby. The girl looked at her in surprise, not understanding why she was suddenly acting as normal as if the previous day had completely disappeared. Sienna thought about the fact that she hadn't been reborn overnight after all. It was just the next morning, and she couldn't forget all the actions and words from the previous day. Logan, who skillfully concealed all his emotions, said that he had not heard of such a lake, but Daisy continued to insist, and said that perhaps, in that case, he would keep her company, and the two of them would go there, and asked if he was not curious to know. For a while the man pondered her words without uttering a word, but their conversation was soon interrupted by an elderly woman who had brought them breakfast already. Sienna, watching Logan, thought about the fact that he probably wouldn't be curious to see this lake, since he wasn't even a traveler at all. When Granny brought them a cart with various desserts, she smiled and said that she probably should have gotten up early, since it was just the right day to take care of the estate. When Daisy heard this, she asked in surprise if she really wanted to do these things so early. But the woman said she did because winter was coming, which meant she had to go and deliver something else. Sienna then rose from the table and told her grandmother not to do that, but to rest for now, for she herself could go and help her pass the thing on. Then she asked if she could go with the butler and Daisy could go with them, and they would be back very quickly, and she wouldn't even have to bother. When her friend heard this suggestion, she became uncomfortable. She turned to Sienna and asked if she wasn't going there with the services, because she thought that since she was, she didn't think it was necessary for her to go. However, the girl thought that she should stop having fun and work at least a little. But then suddenly the grandmother said that the girls should rest and enjoy their youth. She could go there and back quickly herself. But Sienna still insisted and said it was very cold that day, so she could do it all herself. But her grandmother didn't want her to bother, and she didn't want them young girls to bother. Suddenly Logan got into their argument and said in a very confident voice that he was going with her. Sienna was very surprised to hear this and looked at him, not realizing if he was really suggesting it or just out of politeness. But when she saw his confident look, she realized that he meant it. Grandma smiled at that moment and said that it was very good. She decided not to resist any longer and said that she would have gone herself, but her knees were hurting. Then, smiling, she said she would wrap their lunch, so she asked them to wait a little longer. Sienna was alarmed by her grandmother's reaction. She realized, however, that there was no turning back, so they soon had a wagon ready for them to go on their errands. When the girl was ready, she went outside. I decided to escort her to the carriage and asked in a worried voice if they were really going to go together. Sienna smiled and said that it was not just the two of them, but the three of them, because the butler was also going with them. Then A glanced at her friend and added that if she wanted to go with them, she could, but she realized she wouldn't, because she was too lazy. As expected, Daisy smiled and said she wasn't going after all, and wished them a good trip. The friend said she was grateful and added to make sure she rested properly the castle. At the last, you had already smiled. However, it was certainly not a sincere smile. Soon the boy and the girl were getting into the carriage, and Daisy waved goodbye. She looked sad, even though she had refused to go. But as soon as Sienna approached the wagon, she was very surprised. She didn't understand if he was really going to ride upstairs, and that even surprised her. Well, as soon as she approached, Logan held out his hand to her and told her that if she was okay with it, He'd like her to ride beside him. The girl was at first very surprised, but of course, immediately quickly agreed to the proposal, and then she put her hand in his. It was a pleasant enough touch for both of them. While the girl held her hand in his, Logan watched her intently, but showed no emotion. Sienna, already in her turn, who had been staring intently at the man, was very much surprised, for she had never noticed that his face could glow like that. But soon, with his help, she climbed up and sat down beside him. The girl actually thought about the fact that this guy, with his appearance, seemed to be turning the uncouth carriage into a real imperial carriage. Then the man took the special ropes he used to steer the horses, and said that they could leave now. Sienna smiled and agreed. In the meantime, she looked at the beautiful and clear sky, saying that it was incredibly beautiful. In fact, this trip turned out to be a lot more fun than the girl had expected for herself. Soon they finally arrived where they were going, and when the girl got out of the carriage, it surprised her very much. Sienna, watching the man's actions, thought about the fact that he was really overdoing it somehow. At this point, the coachman turned to Logan and said that since they were almost done, he would be turning around now. The guy agreed and said that they would do everything themselves, and added that they would meet in the castle itself. Well, at that moment, Sienna suddenly saw him grabbing his arm. She immediately went over and told him not to overburden himself. After all, he was still recovering from that incident. Logan, however, replied that he didn't really have a problem with it, and went back to the work he was supposed to be doing. The girl observes all this, and assumes that this is probably a first for him, for he is not quite adept at doing these things yet. She pretends to look at the map, but at the same time she peeks at the way he is doing the work. When the man had already done all that was necessary, he came closer to her and told her that they had only one house left. Sienna looked at the circled places on the map and said that all they had to do was go to the house that was on top of that mountain, and showed him with her finger exactly where it looked on the map. They were still looking at the card for a while, but after that the girl bent it, and then pulled out a napkin to wipe something off his face. Sienna asked him to stop, and she started wiping it off. He continued to hold the log and said he could do it himself, but only later, when he was done. The girl still insisted on her own way, and then he sat down on his knee and she began to wipe him, telling him to stand still, for she would do it quickly. And so, as she began to bring the rag up to wipe off the dirt, she suddenly felt her hand begin to shake very violently. The girl was worried, not understanding why her hand was suddenly shaking so much, but tried to reassure herself, telling herself that she was just wiping sweat and there was nothing wrong with it. Logan looked at her angrily, not understanding why she hadn't already wiped off that sweat, and they could have moved on. But the girl, seeing the look on his face, apologized, saying she was just too worried. But then suddenly the man, hearing her words, asked if she had accidentally hurt herself. Apparently he was very worried about her. Sienna said she was fine, but her hands continued to shake. She thought that if she turned a blind eye, she was basically fine. She decided to change the topic of conversation and asked if they would go there already. Logan took his boards and said that he would just deliver it and they would go right away. Sienna smiled and said that of course she wouldn't mind. Soon they set off to do the rest of the work. The place they came to was quite beautiful and picturesque. When they approached the house, the owner immediately came out of it. When he saw firewood in the man's hands, he said that he was a woodcutter himself, so he already had the materials prepared. Logan was a little confused when he heard that, and Sienna, because she was so emotional, said that there must have been some mistake. She apologized, saying that they'd already brought the firewood and asked if they could keep it. Eventually, when all the work was done, clouds suddenly began to gather outside, indicating that it was going to start raining very soon. Sienna was still thinking about that situation. She knew that her grandmother should definitely have checked all the documents, and she didn't understand how such a misunderstanding could have happened at all. Then she turned to Logan and said that she should be sure to tell her that this was the lumberjack's house, and next time it would be okay not to visit. Logan agreed and said that was the most logical thing to do. They continued down the stairs, and the girl apologized for making him work extra hard. However, the man replied that there was nothing wrong and that everything was fine, but she still insisted and said that the road was steep and he was carrying the heavy wood. But the girl had no time to finish her sentence, when suddenly her foot slipped off one of the steps and she began to fall. Logan noticed it in time, so the girl didn't fall to the ground. He wrapped his arms around her, keeping her from getting hurt. Because the man was running so fast, he also fell down the steps and hit himself. However, the girl did not seem to be hurt, because she was in his arms the whole time. When Sienna opened her eyes, she noticed that she was lying on top of him. She was still a little bruised, though, and her head was a little sore. The girl quickly got off him so they wouldn't be as awkward, and Logan pulled himself up, looking at the girl and also wondering if she was okay. Sienna looked at him and said that she didn't think it was a good time to worry about her, and also wondered if he had broken anything. The man got to his feet and began to wipe the dirt from his clothes. He said that it was really all right, and much better that they had fallen near the end of the stairs. Otherwise it would have been worse. Sienna looked him over from head to toe and pointed to his arm, asking if he was all right because he was bleeding. Logan looked where she had looked and said it was nothing, just a scratch. But when the girl looked more closely, she saw many different cuts and bruises there. She was furious that he said he was fine, even though he obviously wasn't. So the girl asked that he give her his hand. Soon she skillfully dressed his wound, so that the bleeding even stopped. Sienna said that the Earl had come to their land and hurt himself twice already, so she felt bad about that, but Logan replied that she could really not worry, since everything was fine. She thought at that moment that for her, a girl who was living her second life, such adventures were overkill. What could she say about him? Sienna really hoped that nothing would happen on the way back, because a third incident in such a short time would be too much. Soon it suddenly began to rain heavily, and the girl said that apparently it wasn't over yet. For a while they just stood and watched. But when Logan suddenly noticed that the rain was starting to get heavier, he said they'd better go into the enclosed area soon. Very quickly they were back again, and when the girl had changed into dry clothes, she stood near the window, looking out at those lightning bolts that flashed behind it. Logan just watched her for a while and then, stepping closer, asked if she believed there were special partners who were destined by fate. When the girl heard this, she looked at him in surprise and asked him what he was saying. She couldn't believe that he could actually ask such questions. Sienna hadn't expected it to be so romantic for a man who showed no emotion at all. When the man repeated his question, she said she didn't even know. Logan also said that he had heard that the girl was an unmarried woman. She was a little confused at the words, but said that the opportunity had not yet presented itself. But she will definitely get married someday. The girl at this moment thought that the most important thing was to watch out for Earl Page. Besides, if she wanted to live her life with dignity, she could even try her hand at some investments. Then she asked Logan himself if he even believed it because she really wondered. But the man was even confused, for he had not expected that she could ask such a thing. Sienna said, smiling, that it was hard to answer a question like that right away, and he could see that. Soon after, Sienna traveled with Daisy to the magic lake, but they didn't see what they wanted to see there. Daisy, when she saw only her reflection there, said it was very strange, because it was the day of the full moon. And then she wondered if her grandmother had gotten it wrong, and if maybe you should go to a full moon once every 10 years. The girl thought for a moment, and then said that it was quite possible. But in fact, she thought that of the magical, this source had only a name, and she felt very sorry for those who specially come and visit it in order to see something. At the moment, what alarmed Sienna the most was that Logan, who had gone along with them, was standing nearby and watching their actions so intently. Then the man himself approached the lake and gazed into its depths. But suddenly, a memory from his childhood came to his mind. When he was still very young and he overheard his mother talking to the butler, she wondered if His Majesty had not returned that day either. The worker replied that it was not for sure because the day was not over yet. However, the girl got even more angry and asked him what the hell he was talking about. Logan took all these fights very seriously, but still sat most of the time under the door and listened to these horrible conversations. And after such quarrels, the boy got very much because he was morally humiliated. Then his hands quite often trembled, and once at breakfast he suddenly accidentally dropped his fork. His mom got very angry and angrily asked him how many times he had dropped that fork already. The boy apologized to her, but she didn't care. She took him by the hand and began to lead him away somewhere, telling him that he had no right to eat with her since he didn't know the basic rules of behavior. He ended up being locked alone in a dark room. Logan knocked, saying that he was wrong and that he wouldn't do it again. However, his mother didn't care either. She asked him to be quiet and repentant until she let him out. The woman didn't understand how he could be so much like his father, and she felt sick just looking at him. Logan cried very hard, then turned to his mother, not understanding why she was saying such horrible things. Because of the fact that she repeated it time after time, then he even began to believe that he was disgusting and that he was like his father. It was horrible. Soon the woman found a new husband. However, their happy life did not last very long, and the same terrible scandals began again. Logan lay on his bed listening to them fight amongst themselves, and the maid who was next to him couldn't watch. Her heart was breaking at what he was going through. The man scolded at her, asking why she was bothering him at all, and would do better to attend to domestic matters as befitted a prince's wife. But the woman was always worried that her husband might cheat on her, and she didn't even know which women he was seeing. However, the man justified his actions by saying that it had all been decided when the prenuptial agreement was established and all the details were spelled out, so she knew what she was getting into. Hearing the owners raising their voices louder and louder, the maid went over to Logan and covered him with a blanket, telling him not to listen to all this, and just sleep and rest, because he didn't need to get into these scandals. Logan wished more than anything that this would end soon, because he couldn't listen to any more of this. But one day he went into his mother's room and saw a terrible sight. The boy did not expect to see such a thing, and because of that he even fell to the floor. Immediately the maids came running, who began to soothe him and cover the boy's eyes, for he was not allowed to look at such a thing. Logan began to shout for his mom to help, but it was all to no avail. Her body had already had time to ooze in the meantime. His childhood was not the best, and so when Logan grew up, he was always loaded with various jobs that he had to do. One day his assistant came in and told him that he would be 24 years old very soon. He put some pictures of women in front of him and said that others his age were getting married and having children. Logan didn't like all that, of course, and said the guy was saying it as if he were an unsold male dog who was the only one left in the bazaar. He asked that the guy pick his own girl. If he couldn't, the guy would do it for the sake of the family. But Logan suddenly became very serious, and said that he should watch his words after all, for he had already begun to overstep his bounds by talking about his ancestors. The guy realized his mistake and said that a lot of people talk about choosing partners of destiny and all that. And rumor has it, the Marquis locks have an amazing spring that shows your future partner. Logan didn't say anything to that. He didn't like the whole idea, of course, but his assistant said that he wouldn't lose anything by checking whether it was true or just a rumor of the people. And now Logan stood in front of that lake, thinking that he had gone too far in believing him. But he still had some hope. So he walked closer and looked down into it. For a while there was just clear water in which he saw his reflection. Then the man was about to leave because it was no surprise. A second later, however, he suddenly saw the reflection of a girl in the water. It was fuzzy at first, but it grew brighter every moment. It was Sienna. The girl's reflection was in the water, and it was looking intently at Logan, smiling at him. The man at that moment couldn't believe that it was really happening. The next morning, having already figured out everything he was going to do, Logan packed his things and started to leave. He was escorted out by all the ladies of the estate. Logan was assigned a horse, and he thanked the attendants for everything they had done for him. In fact, he was really glad to be greeted like this. Daisy, smiling at the man, told him to let her know if he was ever in the capital again, for she would give a sumptuous dinner such as he had never seen in his life. Sienna, hearing this, thought that the food would probably be something he had never tasted in his life, such as her. The girl still couldn't understand how she could even all this time consider this horrible girl an angel, listen to and even heed her advice and thoughts. Then she turned to Logan and asked if they would see each other again. The man said they would if she wanted them to, as fate would sort of tell her. Sienna was very surprised when he said about fate, After all, it was only last night that they had seen the magic spring, and on this day, he had suddenly decided to leave right away. The girl assumed that he was probably just disappointed because he didn't see anything in the spring, so he wanted to leave. At that moment she suddenly laughed, and after thinking about all this, she realized that you couldn't tell from him that he could care about such trivial things. Sienna immediately apologized for her laughter, and the man said it was all right. He didn't know how to thank her, for she had even provided a horse for him. But the elderly woman, who was just calming the horse down because it was very nervous, said it was fine, and also added that if he were to stop by the area again, he could bring the horse back then. Then Logan took his leashes and said that since they had discussed everything, he would be on his way soon. The man set off, and for a while they were all silent. Well, then suddenly Daisy spoke up in a very sad voice and said that she was incredibly sad that she couldn't even have a proper conversation with him. Sienna was very surprised when she heard that, and she didn't understand how she could be sad. And her friend said that maybe she would never be able to meet a cool guy like him again, and she had missed such a great chance to get to know him better. Then the girl thought about the fact that she probably had in mind the kind of guy who would ignore her and not do everything the way she wanted. Then Daisy said that this time on the arrival of Viscount Watson's daughter, she had decided to provide them with a groom, and asked her friend if she would go to the event. Sienna replied that she was more interested in who her fiancé was. Then her friend said that they weren't engaged yet, so he wasn't her fiancé yet, and she didn't know if it made sense to introduce him. These words made the girl angry, and she realized that he was definitely her man. After all, they fit each other incredibly strongly, and she really wanted this terrible man not to stay her, and was ready to do everything for the sake of it. When they returned to the manor, the maid told the lady that her father had called for her. The maid told her that her father had called for her, and she assumed that something must have happened, since he had asked her to come. The maid replied that she didn't know for sure, for she had only seen him from the back. She closed, and soon arrived at her father's house. She thought about the fact that Logan couldn't have made up his mind so quickly, but there was a thrill of excitement inside her. However, as soon as the girl crossed the threshold of the room, she suddenly saw someone's blonde hair turned toward her. She concluded that it definitely wasn't Logan, but even from the back she could recognize the man, so his presence certainly didn't make the girl happy. Seeing his daughter, the father asked that she say hello, for it was Earl Page. The man gave her a glimpse and smiled in greeting. Sienna was in a panic. She didn't understand what he was doing here. After all, there was nothing between her and George. At this point, she didn't know if she would still go to Daisy's engagement party, since it hadn't happened in the past. All this time she just stood there, staring at the man who was watching her intently. Then her father suddenly asked why she was still standing, and Sienna, apologizing, moved closer. When the girl suggested that perhaps he had come in the past, and she just didn't know about it, because she had only met him because she had returned to the manor early, it really surprised her. The man rose from his seat and, kissing the girl's hand in greeting, said he was incredibly honored to meet her. Sienna looked confused, and however, also told George Page that she was glad to meet him. But then she wondered what had brought him to them. In fact, there was no honor for her, for he was a scoundrel who until his death had not even shown his nose near his wife. Then the girl hoped that nothing more would happen, for there was no hint of it. Suddenly her father intervened in the conversation and said that he had already mentioned that the Count was making jewelry made of crystals, and her mother's birthday was coming up, so he had invited him to order some jewelry for her. The girl exhaled a sigh of relief then, thinking about the fact that it had indeed happened in the past. But then she just hadn't come back yet. But she still wondered why she had been called, if he had business to attend to, and would be leaving soon. But then George smiled, looking her straight in the eye, and said that she had come just in time, for he would like to talk to her. That's when Sienna started to get nervous. She immediately wondered what he wanted to talk about, but then her father left the room, saying that he would go so that they could talk about whatever they needed to talk about without him getting in the way. The girl turned to her father and asked him to stay for a while, but of course he didn't listen and just slammed the door behind him. Then the guy sat down on the couch with her to talk things over, and for a while there was an awkward silence between them. But time continued to pass, and they drank their third cup of tea, and the man still did not talk about business. This alarmed her, for she wanted to get rid of him as soon as possible, and he had not discussed anything with her. Then suddenly George smiled and said that the girl turns out to be much more beautiful than they say she is. Sienna wasn't surprised at the words. She was disgusted by them, for he'd used the same scheme to get her engaged. He'd said the same thing on the day he'd met her, to get her interested. The man continued talking, saying that many people talked about how she wasn't as beautiful as Count Moore's daughter, but overall she was so-so, aside from the peaceful eyes that were more like the shimmers of a lake. Sienna didn't understand how one could even say such things when meeting someone for the first time. However, judging from the surface on first meeting and babbling without looking at his head was an invariable trait of his character, so it just annoyed her. But then suddenly George laughed out loud, seeing her worried face, and waving his hand, said that it was only a compliment. She might not take his words too seriously. The girl also laughed in response, but she didn't realize if that was really how people thought they were complimenting him. Then she decided to also try to do as he did, and said that unlike what she had heard about him, he even had a rather narrow waist in real life. Sienna, still smiling, said that he looked like he was wearing a special corset. She didn't know what about aristocrat men, but here girls would definitely envy his beautiful waist size. When George heard this, he asked in surprise what she meant by it, and the girl said that she really just wanted to compliment him, really hoping he didn't take offense at her because of it. The man became very uncomfortable about it, because he realized that she was alluding to the same kind of compliments he was, and because of that, he just shut up. Then Sienna decided it was time to get to the point, and still wondered what he had wanted to tell her then. George was silent for a while longer, as if remembering what he wanted to say, and then he smiled. He suddenly knelt down, and taking the girl's hand, said that he very much hoped they would have a valuable relationship between each other. The maid who was standing near them was shocked. She had not expected a man to offer such a thing. Sienna was surprised herself. She didn't understand how he could even ask such a thing. After all, they had just met, and she didn't want to have any kind of relationship with him. Sometime later in the morning, Daisy was walking down the street, heading for the wagon. She was still quite sleepy, but still had to be on her way by now. Sienna, seeing her displeased face, said that she was a little late that day, and wondered why that was all of a sudden. However, the girl replied that she was just waiting for her outside, because it was very cold. In fact, there is one unspoken rule in their relationship with Daisy. If they suddenly went somewhere together, Sienna was the one to take her. Then she apologized, saying that if she thought she was going to be late, she could just go first. Sienna laughed and said that there was another carriage at the Earl's estate, so there was no need for them to wait for each other. In fact, she really wished that Daisy had already taken her carriage and horses, because she didn't want to ride with her all the time. But Daisy sat down in the carriage opposite her, and said with a smile that she knew perfectly well that Sienna would wait for her, so she wasn't too worried about it. But then suddenly, she shifted her gaze to Sienna's neck and said that she had just now noticed a piece of jewelry on her, and wondered what kind of necklace it was. The girl, looking at her jewelry, said that she had actually received it as a gift, and there was nothing special about it. But her friend still continued to insist on her own, and asked from whom she had received such a beautiful and expensive gift. Sienna wasn't going to answer her with extended sentences, so she simply replied that she'd gotten it from a man. And she herself, smiling, thought that to be sure it was from her man. She had received such an expensive gift. In fact, when George said that he hoped they would have a valuable relationship, the girl didn't understand at the time, and wondered what he even meant by saying such a thing. Then the man explained that he wanted them to arrange a successful engagement to the Earl of Moore's daughter, and wondered if that wasn't her closest friend. He thought that in that case she might be able to help him with it. Now it all made sense to Sienna. He'd come specifically because of Daisy. But she kept thinking about her old life, and couldn't get used to the fact that this place was different. George, seeing her surprised face, said that in fact she knew a great deal about Mistress after all, and more things were usually shared with friends than with family. In fact, in the past, the girl would have been very happy at those words. She had been happy to be Daisy's friend then, but not now. George, in turn, said that he wanted to know much more about her than he knew at the moment, and really hoped that the girl could help him in this endeavor. He then asked what jewelry she might like and the best bouquets to give to please her. Sienna was surprised to hear this. She said she could certainly help, but she didn't know if Daisy herself wanted all this. George immediately asked what she wanted in return for this favor, for if she could help him, he would be sure to repay her handsomely for such a great favor. The girl, hearing this, was very much surprised. How could he repay her for such a small favor? After all, this man was famous for his stinginess. George continued to tell her about himself and said that, as she was already well aware, their family had been in the jewelry business for a long time, so he had a special, precious gift for her. Sienna immediately inquired what the gift was. Then the man leaned closer to her and asked in a quiet voice if she had ever heard of blue diamonds. The girl became very angry at this moment. Of course she had heard about this jewelry. Her ex-husband had given her a fake, and he had given the real jewelry to his next mistress. But George said that if she would help him with Mrs. Moore, he would give her this piece of jewelry. In fact, no matter how much he was involved in the jewelry business, the Moores were doing much better than his business. And surely George would be uneasy at meeting this family. So she suggested that it might be possible, on principle, to help him, now that things had come to this. After a little more thought, Sienna said she was clear, and she would help him. After all, if people like him were going to succeed, Daisy would have to succeed too. George thanked her immediately and said he would send her the necklace. Of course, the man kept his promise, and soon the maid brought the mail. There was a letter and a small box with a precious piece of jewelry. Sienna, parsing through the letters, saw the last name Grint, and she herself didn't understand why Logan still hadn't invited her. But the maid, when she saw the necklace, asked what it was. The girl explained that it was just a gift, but the maid still insisted, and asked who could give her such a precious gift and why. Sienna explained that she had made a deal with a man, so he had decided to thank her. The maid was even more surprised to hear that, because she hadn't expected her mistress to make deals with anyone. But the girl shifted her gaze to the jewelry and said that it was her business, and in fact the thing was even better than she herself had expected. She continued to gaze at the beautiful necklace, not understanding how stones no bigger than her fingernail could shine and mesmerize her. But the maid asked her to try it on immediately, for she was sure it would look incredibly beautiful on her. The maid helped her make it, and when she saw it, she said it was beautiful, and it suited her incredibly well. Sienna thought about how her maid was always so happy, as if it were her gift, and when she found out George had given her a fake, she cried as if it had happened to her. But then suddenly she took her hands and told Mistress that she just had to wear that necklace and meet the other ladies. She would definitely get all their attention. Sienna smiled at that moment and asked if she shouldn't be the one to tell her that she was the most beautiful. The girl was a little embarrassed and wanted to say something, but she told Nancy that she knew perfectly well, and it was only a joke, so she didn't have to worry. Well then. The girl really got to thinking about Grind's daughter, who throws expensive receptions, and the doll-like beauty Daisy, who always outshines everyone at such events. She wasn't sure she could get their attention, as she had almost never even spoken a word to them at such meetings in the past. Then the girl asked Nancy if she really had to go there, since she didn't really feel like it. Even as a very young girl, Daisy had said that she was her only friend. But now, knowing her ending, the girl was no longer sure that it was the right choice. So she turned to the maid and asked if she thought she should have more friends than one. The maid smiled and said that of course this would be a very good opportunity to make a new acquaintance that she could certainly use in the future. Then Sienna agreed after all. She decided that it would be okay to try, because she needed to muster up the courage to make new connections that could actually be profitable. That's why the next morning she went with Daisy to the event. And as her maid had advised her, she immediately wore this beautiful necklace so that the ladies would take notice of her, and now when Daisy first saw it, she was immediately interested. And when Sienna said it was a gift from a man, Daisy suddenly laughed, asking if she really had some secret man she didn't know about. The girl, hearing these words, became very indignant. She thought that if she was her best friend, It was not so that she didn't know about all her boyfriends and acquaintances. And then she inquired of Daisy whether she thought it would be a good idea to be near the Earl. The girl said it was probably good, for she had seen him last time, but she was not sure. So one must be sure to be very good and judicious in matters of engagement. But Sienna said that he owned a jewelry business, so he would give her various jewels, and he was even more handsome in person than the rumors said about him. Daisy, hearing this, immediately became indignant and asked if she had really seen him in person, and also wondered how it came about. In fact, the girl herself was surprised by the words she said, and she wondered if it would really be possible to look at George after seeing this beautiful Logan. Well, then she explained that her father had invited her over to discuss a gift for her mother. He is taller in stature and face, and also has a lot of money. To the young one she inquired if this was not a good option for a wedding. In fact, it was just disgusting for a girl to say something you don't really think about, and about a person you hate with all your soul in general. She was really hoping that Daisy would at least pretend to be interested. But then suddenly her friend, seeing her enthusiasm, said that apparently she was more interested in him even than she was in herself. Well, of course it wasn't. And Sienna really hoped this would all be over quickly, because she didn't like this conversation at all. From that moment some more time passed, and the rest of the way they rode in complete silence, for it was too awkward to talk. But as soon as they arrived, they were immediately met by a dark-haired girl who wore a very beautiful outfit. When she saw her guests, she said hello and told them that she had been waiting for them. This girl was Chloe Grint. She was the eldest daughter of the Grints and the Crown Prince's fiancée. Sienna was surprised when she saw her, for this girl had a completely different look, as if she could directly make a hole in a person just by looking at them. When Chloe saw the girls, she smiled and said it was like they were sisters, going everywhere and always together. Daisy took the girl under her arm and said it was all true, for their relationship was special. No one else had one like it. But Sienna wasn't as cheerful as the girl, and she really wished that Daisy would just back off already. After all, she had come to this place to make new friends, not scare everyone away in reverse. In fact, Daisy and Chloe represent two diametrically opposed sides, and even smiling at her, Daisy still dislikes Chloe a lot, and it's hard for her to be around the girl. She wasn't sure if their relationship could be called a family rivalry, but it was clearly not friendly feelings for each other. Chloe suddenly turned to Sienna and said admiringly that she was wearing a new necklace that she had never seen before. She said that it suited her, and added that she had made a new one for herself. In fact, no matter how well Daisy lived between earls and dukes, there was still a line drawn. The girl smiled and told Chloe that even though it was beautiful, it was still kind of plain. The girl smiled and said to Chloe that even though it was beautiful, it was still kind of plain. They sat down on the couch as the girl suggested to them. Then Daisy, turning to Mrs. Green, said that she looked rather bright, and she felt that a more luxurious outfit would suit her better. Sienna, who had been silently watching all this, realized that it wasn't about the design after all, but that she was just ignoring his size, and thus very much betraying her dislike for the girl. Chloe, with a smile on her face, asked if they really thought it was that simple. Daisy agreed and said that she was a princess, and she might have preferred larger sapphires to emphasize her beautiful eyes. The girl then said that they were blue diamonds, and wondered if they didn't know that they were more famous than sapphires. When Daisy heard this, she was very surprised and asked how it could be so. Then Chloe decided to tease her, and said that she didn't think that such a noble lady would know less about fashion than she thought. The girl already wanted to object something and somehow defend herself in this situation, but at that moment the girl said that Mrs. Nelson, who was sitting next to her now, had also put on blue diamonds that day. Sienna became uneasy, and her best friend at this point began to scrutinize her with her eyes. Apparently she hadn't noticed what these stones were before. In fact, Sienna had expected far less attention than she was currently getting, and felt very awful because of it. Soon other ladies came to Tim's event, and they also began to scrutinize the girls and what they were wearing and what jewelry they were wearing. And all the while, Daisy continued to stare at the girl, and Sienna had no way of knowing why she still hadn't averted her gaze, and assumed she must think she was wearing them on purpose. But Sienna herself thought at that moment about what she was saying, for she had been told back in the wagon that she had received the necklace as a gift from the man, and she did not understand her friend's reaction now. Sienna turned to her, laughing awkwardly, and wondered if she really didn't know that. At first she started to draw air into her lungs, and was silent for a while. But after that she began to laugh loudly and asked how she, such a noble lady, could not know about it. Then she turned to the hostess of the event and said that her dear Mrs. Nelson also wore such stones, so she knew very well about these gems. Then she also added that she also has some blue diamonds at home. Chloe smiled and said that of course, for it could not be that Mrs. Moore did not have such jewels, that she was ignorant of such delicate things. Daisy continued to defend her knowledge and asked that the girls think, for she could not help but know what Mrs. Nelson herself knew, for they were very close to her. Sienna looked at her friend and saw that she had a very intense look in her eyes, and realized that it was probably a request for the girl to be supportive. Then she decided it would be best to be supportive after all, so she said that a person who was as passionate as she was about collecting jewelry couldn't just not know such basic things. Then she turned to Daisy and said that perhaps because the stones were too small, she hadn't gotten a good look at them because of the distance. Then she added that next time she would have to wear something larger so that she could see what they were. Chloe, who was watching all of this intently and even smiling, was surprised that Sienna could show her emotions so openly, but she even enjoyed it. Suddenly, the other ladies joined in the conversation. One of them looked at Daisy and asked if Mrs. Moore had put on her new dress. The girl smiled, pleased that someone had noticed. Then she said that it was actually a dress from Madame Taylor's atelier. But a guest commented that there are so many rumors about how you usually have to make reservations there a year in advance to get anything, because it's a very popular place. Daisy, feeling comfortable because the attention was back on her, said she had a close acquaintance there, so she didn't have to wait. But another lady intervened. She was surprised to hear Daisy insist that the dress was from Madame Taylor's atelier. But Sienna wondered with a smile on her face if she was confused, for it was she who had been turned down at Madame Taylor's atelier, and so had to order elsewhere. Daisy was embarrassed, and she asked in a shaky voice if it was really so. Sienna noticed not her confusion, however, but the third time Chloe stared at her, and realized that it was no accident. She couldn't believe that Chloe was watching her and her reaction. Then she thought that if she continued like this, she might even be able to get closer to Chloe. Here suddenly the ladies laughed because of this confusion, and Daisy decided to save her situation, and said that she must have really got mixed up. One of the guests, still laughing, asked what difference it made where the dress was ordered. It suited her very well. And then she turned to Mrs. Watson, saying that they had heard that she had met the groom, and asked how she liked him or not. The girl, who was now being stared at by everyone, was puzzled and embarrassed. She was silent for a while, and then she said that he was very nice. All the ladies immediately laughed because of this behavior of the girl, but after that they began to ask her about many other things. Sienna, observing all this, concluded that it was fun to socialize together, and she didn't understand why she just sat there like water in her mouth before, and didn't say anything, didn't engage in conversation or socialize with people. But Sienna thought to herself, why should she be surprised? After all, of course everything was immediately obvious. Why did she do it? After all, Daisy was always with her, and the girl simply could not resist her. As the sun began to sink below the horizon outside, the guests gradually began to disperse. Sienna was the first to leave, and turned to Sienna and said sternly that she didn't have to see her off, because she had decided to go with Thurman. The girl, hearing this, was very surprised. Then she said not to be frightened, for she had not even said that she was going to see her off in any way. The next day Sienna got mail again, and Nancy brought it to her mistress, saying it was again Earl Page. The girl, reading the letter, realized that he apparently wanted to discuss something again and meet with her. But when Nancy saw her reaction, she wondered if she was so unhappy about it, because she had thought she was expecting letters from him. However, Sienna didn't understand what there was to look forward to. It was just a deal, and it couldn't be more than that. But Nancy said she made that assumption, for last time the Count had written to her first too, so she thought he liked her. Mistress, when she heard those words, She shuddered. Then she said that nothing like that had happened, and even if it was true, she would not let it happen. The maid suddenly lowered her gaze and apologized to her mistress, saying that she had been talking nonsense and promised not to do it again. But Sienna realized that she had been too rude and apologized, saying she was not angry with her. It was really all about her worries, and the girl didn't understand how she could raise her voice like that to her gentle Nancy, who was so protective and appreciative of her. However, looking at a confused Daisy, she immediately felt good in her heart. Then she said that she had gotten so angry because she had been thinking about the wrong thing. Sienna then remembered that they were going to go out that day, so she offered to eat some goodies. Nancy said that in that case she would go get ready so she wouldn't be late. The girl agreed with her and told her to dress comfortably because she wanted to have a good walk around the city. Then she held out the letter to the maid that had come to her and asked that she just burn it to begin with. Nancy did not ask any unnecessary questions, but simply did her bidding. Soon the girls were packed up and on their way to the city, with the Volt Prince accompanying them. After a while, Nancy approached Mistress, asking if she would like some lunch. Sienna asked in surprise what she wanted to eat. The girl then hesitated. She didn't expect to suddenly be given the right to choose. But at that moment, the Volta Prince suddenly interrupted their conversation and turned somewhere to the side, turning to look at his mistress. He pointed his finger at a black-haired guy who was standing near some display case and asked if that man wasn't Logan. Sienna, upon hearing his name, immediately started looking around to see if it was really him. Bolt in turn said that he had told them he was traveling to various places, and then added that apparently he had already made it even to the capital. The girl thought it was only natural that Logan had stopped by the capital. However, what made her suspicious was that his clothes had hardly changed. That was why Lord Bolt thought of him as a commoner. But at that moment, Logan suddenly turned and started looking directly at them. Sienna looked him straight in the eye, but didn't say anything. After a while, Logan suddenly turned away and didn't even say hello. The girl was very surprised by his behavior and didn't understand why he turned away, because he could have come up and greeted them. They went on their way, and Sienna was still wondering why he pretended not to notice her, since they had spent time together at the Marquise's house. The girl went forward, with a look she wanted to ask him something, but then suddenly Nancy ran up to her and asked if she was looking for someone. Lord Bolt said he was very frightened, for he had seen exactly where he had gone, so he said he would look for him that way. But Nancy had not heard their previous conversation and wondered who they were looking for. Sienna didn't listen to their conversation, thinking only about whether Logan had seen her, and if he had, why he pretended not to notice and just walked on. But at that moment the girl suddenly heard someone approaching her from behind. When she turned around, she saw the man she was looking for. Logan bowed and told her mistress that he was waiting for her. Sienna was silent for a while, and then apologized in a confused voice. She said she was a little confused and asked how he was doing, adding that she hadn't expected to see him in the capital. Logan stepped closer to her and said with a snowy smile that apparently the goddess of fate had decided to arrange their meeting after all. But then his cheeks suddenly reddened, and the smile quickly disappeared from his face. The girl didn't understand what had happened or why he was suddenly embarrassed. She insisted and said that he had told her that he had been waiting for her. The man agreed and said that he wanted to thank her for what she had done for him, and added that he had a personal request for her. Sienna wondered in surprise if he had come all this way just for that, and thought to herself that he must have just been invited by someone to his dukedom. The man was silent for a while. After that, he said that he couldn't just meet the aristocrat lady, so he didn't come to her directly, but just waited for a chance meeting. Sienna was surprised to hear this. She didn't understand why he was suddenly saying those words, but then Logan took her hands in his and came even closer. The man said that if she suddenly had not yet had lunch, he would like to invite her to lunch and at the same time to talk, and also asked if it would be possible. Of course, the girl agreed to such a proposal. Soon they came to a small restaurant that was located nearby, and Logan ordered them a lot of delicious and luxurious food. Sienna was shocked when she saw all this delicious food. She didn't understand how she could eat such delicious food and still look like a commoner. The boy and girl sat down separately, and Nancy, along with Lord Bolt, remained aside so that they could talk quietly and discuss whatever they needed to discuss. Sienna, when she saw them standing off to the side, was immediately uncomfortable. She decided to cut to the chase and asked Logan to tell her about his request. But she didn't realize what it could be. They'd had no arrangement in their past lives, and if she hadn't decided to go to town with Nancy, there was no telling whether they would have met or not. Logan was really worried about this. He even clenched his hands into a fist and didn't know where to start. The girl, when she saw his excitement, said it was fine. He could just talk freely without any formalities. But Sienna, looking at him, realized that he must have been preparing for this conversation for a very long time indeed. Then Logan suddenly said, very seriously, that he was actually interested in magic. When the girl heard this, she asked in surprise if it was true. She thought to herself that he must be mocking her, but Logan was completely serious and said it was true. That's why he travels in search of places where different magics are located. The girl was very surprised that when they had met, he had mentioned that he had been waiting for her all this time, and had also invited her to dinner, and she couldn't believe that it was just to talk about some magic. Logan kept talking and said that he actually thought about the fact that maybe she had some interest in it too. After all, when she had shown him the magic spring, she had stubbornly glowered with impatience. Sienna was actually pretty bad at it when it came to magic, and besides, the three of them hadn't even seen anything in that lake, but she still decided to wonder what would happen if she was suddenly really interested in this case. Logan got very excited, then said that he would like her to consult him about other magical places. In fact, he said it so seriously that it made the girl uncomfortable. Nancy and Lord Bolt, sitting nearby, heard all this and were shocked. She even choked on her drink at the unexpected suggestion. Sienna thought at that moment that, on the contrary, she should learn about such places, so she decided it would be best to come clean and tell him honestly. The girl turned to Logan and, apologizing, said that she didn't know any such places either. The girl turned to Logan and apologized, saying that she didn't know any such places either. But the man said that it would be very difficult after all. The magic tower was not a place where one could pass through just like that, and a commoner like him would definitely not be able to do so. Sienna, hearing those words, said that he was right after all, and apologized. She thought about the fact that Logan was still living like a commoner, but she didn't know how long he'd be doing it. But then he wondered if she could go with him to the court library. He thought it might be possible to learn something from all the books there. The girl wondered if he really wanted to look for some books on magic with her. Logan said that she'd gotten it right, and if she wasn't busy, he would ask her for that favor. Sienna thought about the fact that no matter how busy she was, it was only going to be embroidery, and she noticed that the course of events she was used to had just changed dramatically, and that pleased her. She thought about it for a while, but finally agreed and said it would be interesting. Then she asked him when he was going to go to the library. In fact, before all this happened, Logan had been sitting in his office for quite some time. He couldn't even do any work properly, for there was no focus in his mind. When a deputy came by and saw Logan was doing nothing, he asked if something had happened to him. Logan, who was immersed in his own thoughts, did not answer immediately. When his assistant repeated the question, Logan said he was fine, and wondered why he was suddenly asking such strange questions. The aide replied that it was just that the gentleman was acting now as if he were a male dog in the spring and straight up expecting to find a female. Logan thought about his words, but didn't react. The deputy was wary, because Logan had usually responded to his jokes before. He wondered if nothing had really happened to Logan. Logan asked how he should behave if the woman he was so eager to become intimate with suddenly appeared. The aide was a little surprised at the question, but replied that he should go where she frequented and pretend that he was there by chance. He also advised Logan to go there now, if he was so eager to see her. Logan packed quickly and said he'd be back soon enough. Several days passed, and Logan continued to try to meet with Mistress, coming at the same time, but to no avail. However, they were able to meet that day, and now they were sitting in a cafe discussing this very important topic. When Sienna inquired when he was going to go to the library, Logan was even confused. He just hadn't expected her to listen to him right away, or even agree to it. It would be strange to listen to a feisty request from someone who wasn't bound by anything, but the girl said he was wrong to think so. She thought to herself, "You can't give yourself away so easily, even if you pretend to be a commoner." She concluded that apparently no one recognized him, since he was so good at getting into character. Logan, who was staring intently at the girl at this moment, even blushed and thought that she was indeed an incredibly beautiful lady. Shortly afterward, Sienna still had to meet George, who was complaining as usual about all his failures. The man said that Mrs. Moore has been constantly busy lately, and because of that, there is no way he can meet with her. However, Sienna hardly listened to him. She told him to pretend it was an accident, and thus meet her. She thought that this method might help. After that, the man continued to talk about his thoughts, but Sienna only thought about Logan, and how he said that it was fate that brought them back together. Shortly afterward, the girl did meet Logan, and they went about their business. The man asked her if she often went to the library. Sienna thought for a while, but then said she liked bookstores better, because they had the smell of old books, and you could even get addicted to that. When Logan heard her words and her beautiful laugh, he smiled and they continued walking for a while in silence. But then suddenly the girl stopped and said that if he smiled, let him try to do it not as secretly as he always did. And at that moment she made her smile very small on purpose, so that she could laugh properly. Logan immediately caught sight of her fur coat, and then they laughed out loud together. But they continued to walk further and further as unexpected guests came out to meet them. Daisy, who was walking with her friends, suddenly appeared in front of the girl, and seeing Sienna, she asked in surprise, "Is it really a girl?" Sienna was confused when she saw her. She hadn't really expected to see Daisy in such a place, but she scoffed, saying that she had been wondering what kind of mistress laughed so lightly in public. Then she shifted her gaze to the side, and suddenly saw Logan. She said she was surprised he'd come with her, and turning to the man himself, asked when he'd gotten to the capital. The man immediately became very serious. His gaze suddenly looked sad, and he said that he had arrived not too long ago. "Yes, if," she said. That makes sense to her then, but she's still glad to see him, though she didn't expect to meet him in a place like this, and then wondered why he was the one suddenly walking around with Sienna. Logana replied in a cold voice that he was with her to do research. But at this moment, Sienna was about to answer for him and say that they just met by chance. But half a sentence later, she immediately stopped talking when she heard his answer. Daisy smiled wryly and said that it made sense to her now. Logan had something to investigate, and Sienna was in this place by chance. That's how they met, and she also said that it was just an amazing coincidence. The girls who had come along with her suddenly turned to her, trying to wonder who it was after all. After all, they had never seen Logan before. Daisy immediately took the initiative. She asked that they say hello, for next to Sienna was the traveler they had met when they went to Nelson's estate. The girls immediately brightened up, and after saying hello to him, they began to ask him, did they really meet such a beautiful man while traveling? It wasn't really an exaggeration because even Sienna had never met a guy as handsome and perfectly built as Logan in her entire life. Daisy giggled and said that it was exactly like that, and they had also created some wonderful memories while they were visiting the Nelsons. But the girls immediately stepped around Logan, and apologizing for their indelicacy, asked him what family he was from. The man was used to such questions, and calmly replied that he was not an aristocrat, but a commoner. Sienna, who was standing nearby and watching all this, thought that it must not be that easy for him to introduce the lifestyle of a commoner who hadn't even received a normal education with such a set speech. She walked over to them and turned to Daisy, apologizing, saying that they still had somewhere to go. So she added that they would see each other again, and was about to leave. She found the whole situation amusing, because the meeting was actually meant for her and Logan and no one else. And the fact that these girls were pouncing on her like this was even annoying. Well, Daisy immediately grabbed her hand and asked her why they were suddenly leaving if they'd all just met. And when she asked Logan if it wasn't fate to meet like this, so she offered to have tea at least. But Sienna suddenly became very serious, and apologizing, said that she would refuse the offer. The girl continued to hold her hand, however, and soon led her away to talk about something. Daisy said in a very quiet voice in her ear that she was offering to drink tea, and they thought it would do Logan no harm either, for he would not be able to spend any more time anywhere else in the company of 4 aristocrats. But Sienna was very annoyed, and asked if she hadn't clearly said that they still had important plans with the slogan, and then wondered if the girl was doing it because he had an appointment with him and she was ignoring him. And Daisy pretended not to understand, and then wondered if they were really close. She wondered why she was so concerned about him, since he was a stranger to them and a commoner. Then her face suddenly brightened, and she asked if it was because she liked Logan, because it was suspicious enough that they had some kind of personal arrangement that she hadn't even told her best friend about. Sienna asked in a cold voice, wondering if it was really. She seemed to be worried about the fact that they liked him, but she thought to herself that of course Daisy had noticed everything, since she was really interested in him. It was true, but she did not think that absolutely everything could be attributed to feelings. Daisy said that since she was, the situation was more complicated, for she was the daughter of a marquis, and he was a commoner. Sienna was indignant, as she is actually the daughter of the Marquis of Nelson, who was granted an estate by the governor and has a deep family history. Daisy then looked at Logan, who continued to talk to the ladies, and said that he was certainly handsome, and it would be nice if he were an aristocrat. Then the girl looked angrily at her friend and asked if she had already said everything, and if so, she would already go to Logan, because they had really important things to do. But she didn't wait for Daisy's answer, saying that if that wasn't all there was to it, she would speak out next time. When her girlfriend heard all this, she was very surprised. But soon Sienna was already back to Logan and smiling asked if they could now go to the library for the end. It took a while for them to arrive at their destination. They stayed there for quite a long time, for they collected a lot of books that had something to do with magic, in order to learn as much information as possible. However, Sienna continued to walk between the shelves and brought more and more books to the stack. Behind these books, it was already hard to see Logan, who was already tired of her just looking at them. But soon the girl brought a few more books, and they finally got down to business. She asked Logan if he'd found anything yet, when they'd examined some copies. The man replied in a sad voice that he hadn't found anything yet. But when Sienna came closer to him, she said that he still seemed to be on the same page as he had been a little while before. Logan explained that he can't read very well yet. That's why he thought about every sentence, because the book seemed complicated to him. The girl replied that now everything was clear to her, but she herself could not understand how it was so. A respected prince, and could not read well. But it had been hours since they had been able to leave the library. It was getting dark outside, and the girl's back was starting to ache from the constant sitting. Logan then asked if she was tired for the day, and Sienna said that actually finding places that had to do with magic was much harder than she thought. But really, what was more important to her was that because they were constantly meeting gazes, it was impossible to even concentrate on a single sentence.